My name is Celine, and I'm 34 years old. Last Christmas, my billionaire uncle tried to humiliate me at the family dinner table. But what happened next left everyone speechless. The night was bitter cold, but Richard's mansion glowed like a beacon on the snowy hillside. Every year, my uncle spared no expense, hosting Christmas dinner, gleaming chandeliers, a 20-foot Christmas tree dripping with gold ornaments, carolers at the door, and a spread that looked like it belonged in a royal banquet. My cousins, aunts, and uncles bustled about the place, dressed in designer clothes, sipping champagne, bragging about their careers, cars, and vacations. Everyone's laughter was loud, a little too loud as if competing to be heard. But through it all, the real star of the night was Uncle Richard. He was a billionaire. The kind of man people whispered about even outside the family. A self-made tycoon, or so he claimed. His wealth had made him the center of attention for decades. At every family event, his approval was the currency people fought for, and he knew it. I, on the other hand, was the black sheep. For years, I had struggled to stay afloat. Dead-end jobs, renting small apartments, bills piling up. In my family's eyes, I was the disappointment, the one they pitied. To them, I was Celine, the one who never figured it out. As I walked into the dining room, I felt the usual eyes on me, some smirking, some pitying, others dismissive. I found a seat near the end of the massive table, while Richard sat at the head like a king on his throne. Dinner was served, and as plates of roast turkey, glazed ham, and lobster tails filled the table, Richard launched into his usual show. "Closed a deal last week," he boomed, waving a glass of wine. "Worth more than most people here will earn in their lifetime." The room erupted in applause and laughter. My cousins leaned in, wide-eyed, hanging on every word. I stayed quiet, cutting into my food, letting the noise wash over me. I had grown used to it, the way Richard flaunted his wealth, the way the family fawned over him. Then it happened. Richard turned his piercing gaze on me, his voice cutting through the chatter. "So, Celine," he said with a sly grin. "Still struggling with rent?" The table fell silent. Then erupted into laughter. My cousins snorted into their wine glasses. One aunt actually slapped the table, wiping tears of amusement. Even my mother lowered her head, embarrassed for me. I forced a smile, though my stomach twisted. My uncle had humiliated me before, but this time, it cut deeper. Maybe because he had chosen Christmas, a night meant for family and warmth, to make me his punchline. I wanted to lash out, to throw my napkin on the table and storm out. But instead, I stayed calm. Because unlike the years before, I was carrying a secret. The truth was I wasn't struggling anymore. I hadn't been for a while, but nobody in that room knew it. They still saw me as the failure. The invisible one. I leaned back in my chair, letting the laughter die down. Richard smirked, certain he had scored his victory. But inside, I felt a spark. Not of shame, but of anticipation. Because this Christmas, the game was about to change. And when I revealed the truth, the entire family, including Richard, would never look at me the same way again. Christmas humiliation. The laughter around the table lingered far too long, echoing in Celine's ears like a cruel chorus. Her Uncle Richard leaned back in his chair, basking in the amusement he had sparked. He thrived on these moments, reminding everyone of his power, his wealth, his ability to turn anyone else into the butt of a joke. Celine forced herself to sip her wine, her expression unreadable. She had spent years perfecting that skill, pretending the words didn't sting, even when they pierced deep. But inside, her heart pounded, her chest tight with humiliation. Richard wasn't done. "You know," he said, spearing a slice of turkey with his silver fork. "It's a shame you never took my advice, Celine. I told you years ago, if you want to get ahead, marry rich, or work for me. But no, you had to find your own path. How's that working out for you?" Another round of laughter erupted. One cousin chimed in. "Maybe we should pass the plate twice for Celine, get her some leftovers to take home." Her mother shifted uncomfortably, eyes fixed on her plate. She murmured, "That's enough." But her voice was too soft, drowned out by the noise. Celine clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to shout, to stand up and expose Richard for the arrogant tyrant he was. But she held her tongue, because timing mattered and she wasn't ready yet. She glanced at the chandelier above, its crystals reflecting the golden glow of the room. Everything here screamed wealth and status. And yet, it all felt hollow. She remembered the small apartment she once rented, the nights when she could barely afford groceries. The family thought she was still there, still scraping by. They didn't know she had climbed out of that pit on her own terms. Richard continued to dominate the table, boasting about his latest skyscraper investment, his yacht docked in Monaco, his generous donations to charities that ensured his name was etched on plaques and banners. The family clapped and praised him at every pause, desperate for his approval. Celine noticed how they leaned toward him, eyes shining, hoping to catch crumbs of his glory. It made her stomach turn. "Celine," Richard said suddenly, his voice booming again. "Tell us, what exciting thing did you accomplish this year? Manage to pay your electric bill on time?" The table roared with laughter. Celine's lips curved into the faintest smile. Not a smile of defeat, but of patience. She lifted her glass and said calmly, "Actually, Uncle, I've had quite an interesting year." The laughter slowed, a few heads turning her way. Richard raised an eyebrow, his smirk still fixed. "Oh, do tell." But Celine didn't elaborate. She let the silence stretch, sipping her wine, her eyes steady. She saw the unease flicker in her cousins' faces, the way they exchanged curious glances. For once, the mockery felt less certain, less safe. Inside, Celine's heart raced. She thought back to the nights of sacrifice, the sleepless evenings working on her project, the rejection emails from investors, the countless times she wanted to give up but didn't. They thought she was a joke. They thought she was still the failure at the far end of the table. But soon, they would learn just how wrong they were. And when the truth came out, Christmas dinner would never be remembered for Richard's arrogance, but for the moment, Celine shocked them all. Backstory of struggle. As Celine sat quietly at the table, letting her uncle and cousins fill the room with their bragging, her mind drifted back. The sneers and laughter weren't new. They had been part of her life for years, woven into every family gathering, every phone call, every sideways glance. It hadn't always been that way. When she was younger, she had dreams just as big as Richard's boasts. But life had hit her hard. After college, Celine had struggled to find her footing. While her cousins slid seamlessly into jobs Richard arranged for them, she insisted on standing on her own. She refused to beg him for a position in his empire, knowing it would come with strings that bound her forever to his arrogance. Instead, she worked odd jobs, retail shifts, waitressing, administrative work that paid barely enough to cover rent. Nights were long, and mornings came too soon. Bills piled up. She remembered the sting of opening her fridge to find little more than leftovers and condiments. Her family noticed her struggle. But instead of support, she got pity or worse, mockery. "Celine, you're too proud," her aunts would say. "Why not just ask Richard for help?" Her cousins rolled their eyes whenever she mentioned her plans, treating her dreams as laughable. Even her mother, though loving, sometimes sighed with disappointment. "Honey, maybe they're right. Maybe you should just take the easy path." But Celine couldn't. Something deep inside her refused to give in. So while the family thought she was floundering, she was quietly building something of her own. Late at night, after double shifts, she would sit at her old laptop, studying business models, reading about startups, teaching herself coding and marketing. She poured every extra dollar she earned into her idea, skipping vacations, new clothes, and even Christmas gifts some years. The family saw only the surface, Celine, showing up tired, in simple clothes, without flashy stories to tell. They assumed she was failing. But in reality, every sacrifice was laying a brick in the foundation of something far greater. But each time, she learned refining her skills, sharpening her instincts, toughening her resolve. Then came the breakthrough. A small investor believed in her idea. Not much, just enough to keep her afloat. She and a tiny team of friends worked tirelessly, facing rejection after rejection. But slowly, doors began to open. One client, then two. Then contracts with companies her uncle himself had once dismissed as irrelevant startups. Revenue began to flow. Not just hundreds, not just thousands, but tens of thousands. Then millions. Celine's life had transformed quietly, under the radar. She had gone from scraping by in a cramped apartment to signing leases for properties of her own. From being mocked for rent to quietly becoming a landlord. And through it all, she told no one in the family. Not her cousins, not her mother, not even Richard when he sneered about her pitiful paycheck. She stayed silent, saving the truth for the right moment. Now, as she sat at Richard's lavish Christmas table, listening to him boast about yachts and skyscrapers, Celine felt a strange calm. Because while they still saw her as the struggling black sheep, she knew the truth. She wasn't weak, she wasn't failing. She wasn't invisible. She was stronger than ever. And soon, they would see exactly how much she had built while they were laughing at her. The secret startup. Celine kept her face neutral at the dinner table, but her thoughts burned bright with the truth her family didn't know. They thought she was barely scraping by, struggling to pay rent, living in the shadow of her billionaire uncle. But what they didn't realize was that she had quietly built something of her own, a startup that had turned into a gold mine. It hadn't been easy. The early years were brutal. Celine had always been fascinated by solving problems others ignored. While Richard chased luxury and prestige, she looked for inefficiencies, little cracks in the world where ordinary people struggled. She saw an opportunity in real estate management technology, something her uncle had laughed at. Apps for landlords? He once scoffed at her during a family gathering. That's small potatoes. Real money is in towers and skyscrapers, not apps. But Celine saw what he didn't. Landlords, with small portfolios, struggled to manage rent collection, maintenance, and tenant communication. Property managers wanted something simpler, cheaper, and easier than the bloated systems on the market, so she built it. With two close friends, one a programmer, the other a designer, she worked night after night, refining the platform. At first, it was clunky, riddled with bugs. Investors dismissed her idea as too niche. But Celine persisted, convinced that if she could solve this one problem well, it could scale. Her first pilot launch flopped. Barely a dozen landlords signed up, and most canceled within weeks. She nearly quit. But then, one landlord who had stuck with it emailed her. "This is rough around the edges," he wrote, "but it's the first thing that's actually helped me. Don't give up." Those words became fuel. Celine and her team reworked the platform, fixed glitches, added features that customers actually wanted. Slowly, traction grew. Dozens of clients turned into hundreds, word spread. Property owners in other states began to sign up. And then came the breakthrough. A regional property management company adopted her software across all their units, thousands of apartments. Suddenly, her revenue wasn't just covering costs, it was multiplying. Celine could hardly believe the numbers at first. Contracts worth 6 figures. Then 7. Her tiny little idea had become something real, something unstoppable. Investors who once laughed now lined up to throw money her way. She picked carefully, choosing partners who respected her vision instead of just her profit margins. Within 3 years, her company was valued in the tens of millions. Through it all, she stayed silent. She didn't buy flashy cars or designer clothes. She didn't boast at family gatherings. She let them think she was struggling, even when her bank account said otherwise. Why? Because she wanted the reveal to matter. She wanted the truth to shatter their assumptions, not with words, but with undeniable proof. Now, sitting at Richard's Christmas table, listening to him brag about his empire, Celine almost laughed. Because while he boasted about his skyscrapers and yachts, she knew something he didn't. Her company had just signed a deal with a chain of mid-tier commercial properties. The same chain Richard had once tried to buy into, only to be rejected. In a way, her startup was competing directly with him now. Quietly, subtly but undeniably. Celine looked down at her plate, her lips curving in the faintest smile. Richard thought he was mocking a failure. But he was really mocking his newest rival. And when the moment came, Celine would drop the truth like a thunderbolt and watch the entire room change in an instant. Family tension rises. The clinking of glasses and the murmur of voices filled the grand dining hall. The chandeliers sparkled above, casting golden light over the long oak table decorated with garlands and crystal bowls of sugared fruit. On the surface, it looked like a perfect holiday gathering. But under the warmth of the lights, the air was thick with Richard's ego. "Ah, yes," he said loudly, his voice carrying over the room as he carved into the turkey with practiced grandeur. Closed on another skyscraper project in the city. Prime location, the kind of thing only a handful of people in this country can pull off. The family clapped and oohed like he was performing a magic trick. Celine's cousins leaned in, hungry for every detail. One even whispered, "Imagine if he let us in on just one deal. We'd never work again." Celine sat quietly, sipping her water, letting the words roll past her. She had learned long ago that Richard thrived on attention. The more you fed it, the louder he grew. Her uncle's eyes roamed the table before landing on her again. A sly grin spread across his face. "And Celine, dear, what exciting news do you bring this year? Signed a lease on a new apartment, perhaps? Managed to pay your rent without being late?" Laughter exploded around the table. One cousin snickered into his napkin. Another whispered loudly enough for Celine to hear, "Maybe we should pass the bread twice. She probably needs leftovers." Celine's mother shifted uncomfortably, cheeks red with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to say something, but Celine gave her a subtle shake of the head. She didn't need rescuing, not tonight. Instead of shrinking, Celine leaned back in her chair, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Actually, Uncle, I've had quite a year." The laughter stuttered to a halt. Richard arched an eyebrow. "Oh? Do enlighten us." Celine's calm tone unsettled them. Her cousins exchanged curious looks. One aunt coughed, trying to cover the awkward silence, but Celine didn't continue. She let the tension hang in the air, sipping her wine, her face unreadable. The more they waited, the more uneasy they grew. Inside, Celine's heart pounded, but not from fear. From anticipation. She thought about the documents folded neatly in her purse, proof of everything she had built. Property deeds, company valuations, contracts. She had brought them not because she needed validation, but because she knew Richard would demand evidence the moment she spoke her truth. Her uncle chuckled finally, waving his hand dismissively. "Oh, come now, Celine. No need to be mysterious. If you really had news worth sharing, you'd be shouting it from the rooftops like the rest of us." Her cousins laughed nervously, though the sound was thinner this time. Celine tilted her head, her eyes steady on Richard. "Maybe I don't need to shout. Maybe I'd rather let results speak for themselves." Her mother glanced at her, eyes wide, catching the edge in Celine's voice. It wasn't defiance for the sake of pride, it was the calm certainty of someone who knew more than she let on. Richard forced another laugh, louder than before, as if trying to push down the unease creeping into the room. "Well, until I see proof, I'll assume your biggest achievement this year was remembering to pay the gas bill." The table chuckled, but the sound lacked the cruelty it had earlier. Some of them were starting to sense something was different about Celine tonight. She glanced around the table, meeting their eyes one by one. Her cousins' smirks faltered. Her aunts looked curious. Even her mother seemed to sit taller, sensing a shift. Celine set her glass down gently. Not yet. She wasn't going to reveal everything just because Richard demanded it. Timing mattered and the perfect moment was still building. For now, she let him enjoy his throne at the head of the table. Let him bask in his last night of unchallenged glory. Because soon, very soon, Celine's truth would crash through his arrogance and the family would never look at him the same way again. The first shock. The air in the dining room grew heavier as the night stretched on. Glasses clinked, silverware scraped, but the easy laughter had dulled. Richard still held court at the head of the table, but his jokes landed with less enthusiasm. Even the cousins who usually roared at his every word now seemed distracted. sneaking glances at Celine as if waiting for her to speak again. Celine didn't rush. She knew patience was her greatest weapon. The more she held back, the more curious they became. And when she finally spoke, it would hit harder than any insult Richard could hurl. Finally, as dessert was brought out, towering cakes, candied fruits, and puddings steaming in silver bowls, Richard turned his gaze on her once more. "So, Celine," he said, his tone mocking but with an undercurrent of irritation. "Since you're being so mysterious tonight, why don't you tell us? What exactly have you been up to? Don't keep us waiting." A hush fell over the table. Forks hovered midair. Everyone leaned in. Celine set her napkin down gently, her movements deliberate. She looked around the table, her eyes calm, steady. Then she said, her voice clear, "Actually, Uncle, I bought a building this year." For a moment, silence. Then laughter erupted. Louder than ever. One cousin nearly choked on his cake. Another clapped the table, shaking his head. "A building?" Someone scoffed. "Was it a dollhouse?" Another cousin snickered. Even Richard threw back his head and laughed, wiping a tear from his eye. "Oh, Celine, you nearly had me there. A building," she says. "My dear, leave the big deals to those of us who can afford them." Celine didn't flinch. She reached calmly into her purse, pulling out a sleek leather folder. She opened it, sliding several documents across the table. Titles, deeds, bank records, all stamped, signed, and official. The laughter died. One cousin leaned forward, his face paling as he read the header. This is real. Luxury apartments, downtown." Gasps rippled around the table. Aunts craned their necks, cousins exchanged wide-eyed glances. Her mother covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Richard's laughter faltered, his smug grin wavering. "So you... what? Co-signed? Helped manage? Don't tell me you actually own this." Celine met his gaze. Her voice steady. "I own it. Outright." The room fell into stunned silence. For years, they had mocked her for being a renter, for not owning even a modest home. And now, here she was landlord of a building that dwarfed their own houses. Her cousins whispered furiously among themselves. One aunt muttered, "But how? When did she—" Another shook her head in disbelief. Richard forced a smile, but his eyes betrayed him. For the first time all night, they didn't shine with arrogance, they flickered with unease. Celine leaned back in her chair, folding her hands calmly. "You asked if I was still struggling with rent, Uncle. The answer is no. These days, people pay me rent." Her mother let out a small gasp, her hand clutching Celine's arm. Pride radiated from her eyes, the kind Celine hadn't seen in years. The cousins who once ridiculed her now stared in open awe, some even in envy. But Celine wasn't finished, not even close. Because the building was only the beginning. And when she revealed the full scope of what she had built, Richard's empire of arrogance would finally begin to crumble. Richard tries to dismiss it. For a long, tense moment, the only sound in the dining room was the crackle of the fireplace. Celine's documents lay in plain view, undeniable. Proof of ownership. The same cousins who once mocked her sat frozen, their forks idle, their desserts untouched. Richard was the first to break the silence. He let out a booming laugh, though it rang hollow this time. Well, looks like our Celine has finally dipped her toes into the water. Beginner's luck, that's all. Anyone can stumble into one decent deal." His words hung in the air, desperate and defensive. One cousin, eager to fall back in line, chuckled nervously. "Yeah, maybe she just got lucky. Right place, right time, huh?" But others weren't so sure. They leaned toward the documents again, whispering, "Outright ownership? That's not small change." Celine didn't argue. She didn't need to. She let Richard's words linger, then calmly slid another set of papers from her folder. "These," she said, her tone smooth, "are the deeds for 3 more properties, residential complexes, all fully leased. Combined, they bring in over 7 figures in annual revenue." Gasps erupted around the table. One aunt's fork clattered to her plate. A cousin who had sneered earlier leaned forward, jaw slack. Richard's forced laugh sputtered. You expect us to believe this? That in just a few years you've gone from renting an apartment to owning multiple properties worth millions? Celine tilted her head, her eyes steady. You don't have to believe me, Uncle. But the tenants who send me rent every month certainly do. The room burst into murmurs. Pride flickered in her mother's eyes, shining brighter than the chandelier above. Richard's smile faltered further. His grip on his wineglass tightened. For decades, he had been the family's only symbol of wealth and power. Now, his throne was shaking, and it was his so-called struggling niece who was shaking it. Celine wasn't finished. She leaned back, her voice calm but cutting. You asked if I was still struggling with rent. The truth is, Uncle, I don't pay rent anymore. These days, I'm the landlord. The words landed like a thunderclap. The cousins who once mocked her now exchanged stunned looks. An aunt muttered, She's surpassed us all. Richard's face reddened. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. The family's attention had shifted. For the first time, they weren't leaning toward him, they were leaning toward Celine. And she knew it was only the beginning. Because beyond properties, she had built something far bigger, something even Richard couldn't ignore once it came to light. Flashback to how Celine overtook Richard. The silence at the table was almost satisfying. For years, Celine had been the family's punching bag, the one they whispered about, the one they pitied. Now, their eyes were wide, their mouths shut, their attention fixed on her instead of Richard. She didn't gloat, she didn't need to. Instead, she leaned back, letting the moment breathe, her mind replaying the years that had led here. It hadn't been luck, it had been strategy. While Richard spent decades bragging about skyscrapers and yachts, Celine had studied him. She had watched the cracks in his empire, the arrogance, the overspending, the outdated ways he ran his businesses. Richard thrived on being seen, but in chasing appearances, he missed the subtle shifts in the world around him. Celine saw them, and she used them. Where Richard dismissed technology, she embraced it. He once scoffed at her startup idea, apps for property owners. He'd laughed. That's play money. Leave the real business to me. But Celine knew the truth. The future was in innovation, in solving problems that giants like Richard were too arrogant to notice. She threw herself into building her platform. She started small, one landlord, then 5, then 50. She and her tiny team worked around the clock, updating features, responding to client needs, staying lean where Richard was bloated. When the pandemic hit, Richard's empire staggered. Empty office buildings, stalled projects, expensive overhead. He had mocked digital solutions for years, and now he was stuck in the past. Meanwhile, Celine's platform exploded. Landlords needed remote tools to manage tenants. Property managers needed seamless systems. Her little startup became their lifeline. Investors who had once laughed now begged to get in. Clients spread the word faster than she could keep up with. And while Richard fought to keep his empire afloat, Celine's company was thriving. She remembered the day it truly hit her. She had signed a contract with a mid-tier property chain, the same one Richard had once tried to buy into and failed. Her software was now powering the very units he had coveted. The irony wasn't lost on her. Back at the dinner table, her cousins leaned forward, curiosity sparking. Celine, what exactly do you do? One asked hesitantly. Celine's smile was faint but steady. I built a property management platform. What started small is now used across thousands of units nationwide. And we've recently expanded into commercial properties. Richard stiffened. He knew exactly what she meant. One cousin gasped. Wait, are you saying your company is competing with Uncle Richard's properties? Celine didn't blink. Competing and, in some cases, supplying the tools his competitors use. Gasps filled the room. One aunt covered her mouth. Her mother squeezed her hand so tightly Celine thought she might never let go. Richard's face darkened, the color rising in his cheeks. So what? You built a little software tool. That's nothing compared to real assets. Towers, cities, generational wealth. Celine met his glare calmly. Funny. That little software tool now manages more units than you currently own, and it's growing faster than your entire portfolio. The cousins erupted in whispers, their heads swiveling between Richard and Celine. The shift in energy was undeniable. For the first time, Richard wasn't the sun around which they orbited. Celine was. Richard slammed his glass down, the sound sharp. "You think a few contracts make you my equal? I've built an empire." Celine's voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. "No, uncle, you've built a monument to yourself. I've built something that serves people, and that's why it will last." Her words hung heavy in the air, impossible to ignore. And as the family leaned toward Celine with awe and curiosity, Richard felt for the first time what Celine had endured for years: irrelevance. Family dynamics shift. The dining room felt different now. It wasn't just the fire crackling in the hearth or the twinkle of Christmas lights reflecting in the glasses, it was the way every pair of eyes had shifted from Richard to Celine. Her cousins, who once looked at her with pity or scorn, were suddenly leaning forward, their voices hushed with curiosity. "Celine, how did you even start something like that?" one asked. "Wasn't it risky? What if it failed?" another pressed. "Can you teach me?" a third cousin blurted out, almost embarrassed by their own eagerness. Celine answered calmly, her tone steady but humble. She explained how she had started small, how she reinvested every dollar back into her company, how she stayed patient while everyone else mocked her. She didn't boast, she didn't flaunt. She spoke like someone who had nothing to prove because she didn't. Her mother's eyes shimmered with pride. She reached across the table and squeezed Celine's hand. "I knew you had more in you," she whispered, though Celine could hear the guilt in her tone, as if she regretted ever doubting her. Meanwhile, Richard sat stiffly at the head of the table, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white around his glass. He tried to cut in with his usual booming voice, but it landed flat. Yes, impressive," he barked. "But let's not forget who still owns towers that scrape the sky. Apps and gadgets come and go. Real estate stays." But the cousins didn't turn back to him. Their eyes remained fixed on Celine. Even Emma, the cousin who once mocked Celine for living in a shoebox apartment, leaned closer, her voice hesitant. I owe you an apology. I didn't know. I thought you were wasting your life. But you've done something incredible." Celine offered a small smile. "Apology accepted. It was never about proving you wrong. It was about proving myself right." The words struck deep, silencing the whispers of shame that had once haunted her. Richard's face reddened. He cleared his throat, forcing out another boast. "I closed a deal just last month worth more than some of you will earn in your lifetimes. But nobody clapped this time. Nobody laughed or leaned in. Instead, the silence was suffocating. The weight of his arrogance, once tolerated, now felt petty in comparison to Celine's quiet strength. For the first time, Richard looked small at his own table. Celine sat back, her expression calm but her chest swelling inside. She wasn't trying to take his throne, she hadn't come here to humiliate him, but the truth had done it anyway. And Richard knew, with sinking dread, that his reign as the family's center of gravity was slipping away, falling into Celine's hands instead. The ultimate reveal. The silence at the table was thick, broken only by the faint clinking of silverware as someone nervously shifted their plate. For once, Richard's voice didn't fill the room. His usual booming arrogance had been replaced by a heavy, suffocating quiet. Celine could feel every eye on her, but she wasn't nervous, not anymore. She had spent years preparing for this moment, years of sacrifices, ridicule, and being underestimated. Now, the truth spoke louder than any defense ever could. Richard finally broke the silence. "So," he said, forcing a smirk, "you've bought a few buildings, good for you. But let's not get carried away. You've got a long way to go before you can play in my league." Celine leaned forward slightly, her voice calm. "Actually, Uncle, I didn't stop at buildings." The family froze, forks halfway to their mouths. Celine continued, her tone steady, deliberate. "Earlier this year, I acquired a company. Some of you might remember I pitched the idea years ago at a family gathering, and it was dismissed as ridiculous." She let her gaze rest on Richard. His smirk faltered. It's the same company you laughed at, Celine added softly. The one you said was too small to matter. Gasps rippled across the table. A cousin whispered, "Wait, you bought that company?" Celine nodded. "Yes. And since the acquisition, we've grown it. Our valuation now surpasses several of Uncle Richard's holdings." The room erupted in murmurs, disbelief hanging thick in the air. Her mother's eyes widened with pride, tears welling at the corners. Aunts and cousins exchanged stunned looks, their expressions swinging from shock to awe. Richard's face darkened. "That's impossible. You're exaggerating." Celine reached into her folder again, sliding out the official valuation report. "I don't exaggerate, Uncle. These are audited numbers. We've overtaken more than one of your ventures." A sharp gasp came from the far end of the table. One cousin whispered, "She's worth more than him." The realization swept the room like wildfire. For decades, Richard had been the untouchable giant, the family's shining star. But now, Celine, the niece he mocked and belittled, had outgrown his shadow. Richard's jaw tightened. He gripped his glass so hard Celine thought it might shatter. "So what?" he snapped. "You've made some money. It doesn't change the fact that I built an empire from nothing." Celine's voice was quiet but steady, and it sliced through his bluster. "Yes, Uncle, you built an empire for yourself. I built something that serves others. That's why mine will outlast yours." The words hung in the air like a hammer's strike. Her cousins nodded slowly, admiration dawning in their eyes. Her mother's tears spilled freely, her pride glowing brighter than the candles flickering on the table. Richard sat in silence, his face pale with rage. The family wasn't looking at him anymore. They weren't hanging on his every word. They were looking at Celine. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted completely forever. Richard's bitterness explodes. Richard's hand trembled around the stem of his wineglass. His face, usually smug and composed, was blotched red, his jaw tight with fury. For decades, he had commanded the spotlight at every gathering, every dinner, every celebration. But now, in his own mansion, at his own table, the family was looking past him, eyes wide with admiration for Celine instead. He couldn't stand it. "This is absurd," he bellowed suddenly, slamming his glass down so hard the liquid sloshed onto the white tablecloth. The room jolted in shock. A few aunts gasped. His mother's fork clattered against her plate. Richard pointed a shaking finger at Celine. "Don't be fooled by her little show. She's a fraud. This is smoke and mirrors. She's playing games with numbers, with half-baked ideas. None of it's real." The cousins shifted uncomfortably. A few looked back at Celine, waiting for her reaction. But she didn't flinch. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "If it isn't real, Uncle, why does it frighten you so much?" The words landed like a slap. Richard's face twisted. He shot up from his chair, pacing behind it, ranting louder now. "You think you can stand against me? Me. I built this family's reputation. I made our name mean something. Without me, none of you would know what wealth even looks like." His voice cracked. Under the strain, desperation bleeding into his words. Celine remained seated, her posture relaxed, her eyes steady. "You built your empire, yes, but you built it for yourself. You needed everyone to worship you, to make you feel powerful. I don't need that. I built something that serves others. That's why it's growing." The room fell into a tense silence. A few cousins nodded slowly, their admiration for Celine deepening. Richard pounded his fist against the back of his chair. "Nonsense. You'll see. She's riding a bubble. It'll burst, and when it does, she'll come crawling back begging for help, and I'll slam the door in her face." His voice was raw now, no longer commanding, just bitter. Celine inhaled slowly, then said, "I'm not here to take your place, Uncle. I don't need to. But you should know respect isn't bought with yachts and skyscrapers. Respect is earned with integrity." Her mother reached across the table, tears in her eyes, whispering, "Celine, You sound just like your father." The words broke something in Richard. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh, his eyes wild. "Respect? Integrity? Don't be fooled, all of you. She's just jealous. She always has been. That's all. This is a pathetic grab for attention at my table." But no one nodded. No one laughed with him. The cousins who once parroted his words now avoided his gaze. The admiration he had demanded for years was gone, replaced with silence. Celine rose slowly, her chair sliding back against the polished floor. She didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She simply met Richard's furious eyes with quiet strength. "Uncle," she said softly, "I don't need attention. I don't need validation. Tonight wasn't about proving you wrong. It was about finally showing who I am. And you can rage all you want, but nothing you say can erase what I've built." Her words echoed in the vast dining hall. The fire crackled. The chandelier lights seemed to shimmer brighter. For the first time, Richard looked small, not because Celine had mocked him, but because his own bitterness had stripped him bare in front of everyone. And as he slumped back into his chair, muttering under his breath, the family realized the old order had collapsed and a new one had quietly taken its place. The family's new perspective. For a long while, no one spoke. The tension clung to the dining room like smoke, heavy and unshakable. Richard sat slumped in his chair, glaring into his glass, his pride fractured. The man who once dominated every conversation now looked like a relic of a bygone era. But then Celine's mother broke the silence. Her voice trembled, but it carried clearly across the table. "I am proud of you, Celine. So proud. I always knew you had something inside you, something no one else saw. Tonight, you've proven it, not just to them, but to me too." Her words hung warmly in the air, and Celine felt her chest tighten. For years, she had carried the sting of being doubted, the quiet disappointment in her mother's eyes. Now, to hear pride instead of pity, it was the validation she hadn't known she craved. One by one, the others followed. A cousin who once teased her mercilessly about her small apartment leaned forward, his voice hesitant. I owe you an apology, Celine. I thought you were wasting your life." "I was wrong. You've done more than any of us ever imagined." Another cousin nodded eagerly. "You've inspired me. You proved we don't need handouts or shortcuts. Hard work, patience, it pays off." "I wish I had your discipline." Aunts murmured their agreement. One even dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. "You've become an example for the younger ones. They'll look up to you now, not just your uncle." Celine felt the tide fully turn. For the first time in her life, the family wasn't laughing at her. They weren't dismissing her. They weren't comparing her to Richard. They were admiring her. She didn't boast. She didn't need to. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you. But this isn't about me outshining anyone. It's about showing what's possible when you refuse to give up even when everyone doubts you." Her words struck home. Cousins nodded, her mother squeezed her hand, and the atmosphere softened into something Celine had never felt at a family gathering: respect. Meanwhile, Richard simmered. His eyes darted around the table, watching his family drift away from him, their admiration dissolving into something new, something he couldn't control. For years, he had been the king. Tonight, his crown had slipped. Celine caught his eye and, for the first time, didn't see him as towering above her. She saw him for what he truly was, a man so desperate for validation that he had built his empire on arrogance. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, words he had once told her quietly after another humiliating Christmas dinner. "Patience, Celine. Success is the best answer." Tonight those words had come true. And as dessert plates were cleared and glasses refilled, Celine realized something profound: she no longer needed their approval, because she had finally earned her own. The dinner ends in silence for Richard. The dining room, once filled with Richard's booming voice and forced laughter, now carried a different energy entirely. Conversations flowed, but they orbited around Celine instead of him. Her cousins peppered her with questions about her journey. Her aunts leaned in, eager to hear about the company she had built. Even the younger relatives, usually glued to their phones, watched her with wide eyes, absorbing every word. Celine didn't speak like Richard ever had. She wasn't loud, wasn't showy. She didn't need to be. She answered their questions with humility, focusing not on her wealth but on the lessons she had learned: resilience, patience, persistence. Meanwhile, Richard sat at the head of the table, forgotten. His plate remained untouched, his glass of wine nearly empty. He stared at the flickering candles, the glow casting sharp lines across his scowling face. For decades, Christmas dinner had been his stage. Tonight, it was his prison. Celine noticed, but she didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in watching him shrink into silence. Her victory wasn't in his humiliation, it was in her own growth. She no longer needed his approval, or anyone else's. The waitstaff brought out dessert-rich puddings, spiced cakes, and trays of glossy chocolates. In the past, Richard would have raised a toast, commanding attention with one of his long, self-congratulatory speeches. But tonight, he stayed silent, his fork idle. Instead, Emma, the cousin who had once mocked Celine the harshest, stood with her glass in hand. Her cheeks were pink, her eyes shining. "I think we should raise a toast," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Not to money, not to power, but to perseverance. To Celine, who proved us all wrong and reminded us what real success looks like." Glasses lifted across the table. The chorus of "To Celine" rang out strong, filling the hall. Celine's heart swelled as she clinked glasses with her mother, who beamed with tears in her eyes. She looked down the table, seeing admiration where once there had only been ridicule. Richard didn't raise his glass. He sat in silence, his lips pressed tight, his face unreadable. For the first time in his life, he was invisible at his own table. Celine didn't look his way again. The toast wasn't about him. It was about her journey, her resilience, her strength. And as laughter and conversation returned, warm and genuine this time, Celine realized something profound. This Christmas dinner would be remembered not for Richard's arrogance, but for the night the family finally saw her for who she truly was. And though Richard left the table early, head bowed, Celine remained surrounded by respect, love, and a legacy she had built on her own terms. Celine closes the story. The days after Christmas felt different. For the first time in years, Celine walked into family gatherings without the weight of ridicule pressing on her shoulders. There were no whispers about her rent, no mocking jokes about her failed potential. Instead, she was met with warmth, admiration, and questions, real questions from cousins and aunts who once dismissed her. But Celine didn't let the attention change her. She remained grounded, focused, and humble. Her wealth wasn't a trophy to flaunt, it was a tool. She continued building her company, expanding her properties, and mentoring young entrepreneurs who reminded her of herself when no one believed. Her mother visited often, helping decorate Celine's new home. "I wish your father could see this," she said one afternoon, tears in her eyes. "He always told me you had strength that no one else noticed. He would be so proud." Celine hugged her, her throat tight. "I hope I've honored him, Mom." Meanwhile, Richard's shadow faded. He stopped attending community events. His name still carried weight in business circles, but his arrogance had cost him the loyalty of his own family. People noticed how his empire was aging, while Celine's was growing younger, fresher, stronger. Rumors spread that some of his investors were looking to partner with Celine instead. The irony wasn't lost on her. And yet, she didn't celebrate Richard's fall. She didn't need to. His bitterness was punishment enough. Celine had learned that revenge didn't come from tearing others down, it came from building yourself up until their insults no longer touched you. On New Year's Eve, Celine hosted her own gathering at one of her properties, a rooftop space overlooking the city skyline. The cousins who once mocked her now stood in awe of the view, praising her achievements openly. Her mother beamed beside her, raising a glass. When the clock struck midnight and fireworks exploded across the sky, Celine felt a peace she had never known before. She thought back to that Christmas dinner, to the moment her uncle sneered, "Still struggling with rent?" And she smiled. Because now, she wasn't struggling. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't the family's shame. She was the woman who had endured, who had built something lasting, who had risen above every insult and every doubt. Celine lifted her glass to the sky and whispered softly, "Success is the best answer." The fireworks roared overhead, painting the night with light. And Celine knew, deep in her bones, that her story was just beginning. The girl once mocked for rent had become the woman who owned the skyline, and no one, not even Richard, could take that from her.